All right, let's dive in. So Jose, can you just tell us a little bit about your story and how you connected initially to Make the Road, your history of Make the Road?
Yeah, if at any point, just on audio, like it gets noisy or you can't hear me, let me know and I can put some headphones in.
Sounds good.
Um, so I started at then Make the Road by walking in the summer of 1999. So the quick story was I was about to start high school, and it was that kind of gap year between eighth and ninth grade. And I had finally gotten that little blue card that said I can go ahead and get a summer youth job that summer. And so I went out looking for work, mostly around the commercial corridors, Myrtle Avenue and Knickerbocker Avenue. No real success at like Jimmy Jazz or Foot Locker. And so as I was walking one day from Myrtle to Knickerbocker to continue the search and ask people for work, in between both corridors, you hit Grove Street. And I'm a Bushwick and Williamsburg kid. I've been in the neighborhood since I was, 2, 3 years old. And so for some reason, I decided to turn left on Grove. I don't know what it was. I just figured out, like, I'd never go down the street. Let me go down this street and then cut across to Knickerbocker. And you know how Make the Road looks. It's kind of a fully residential block, but then one of the residences has a storefront office in the middle of the block. That's hard to see from the corner. So as I'm walking up the block, I noticed the storefront. And there's this banner that's like Make the Road by Walking. And on the window, they got all kinds of posters and signs that are about respect and dignity and community power. And so I was like, what is this place? And I peek in. And when I peeked in, I saw two of my cousins, Jesus and Julissa, inside. And they were talking to Una, who I'd not known at that moment, who was one of the founding directors. And so, of course, what do you do when you see your cousins? You walk in like, yo, what's up? So I walk into the shop. And the conversation that they were having with Una in that moment was about the exact experience that I was going through. It was about the lack of youth services and the lack of youth employment opportunities. And I was like, yeah, this is crazy. Like, my cousins are here. They belong to this space somehow. And the thing they're talking about is the thing that I'm currently trying to figure out in my life. And Una is just a natural organizer, right? Like she was just like, man, like, first of all, told us like, I bet you're not the only young people who have these questions and concerns. And then she also told us that she wanted us to come back, right? Because this was a community space where we talk about those kinds of problems and issues. And she'd love to continue the conversation. And she'd love for us to bring more young people along from our circles that we thought may be experiencing the same thing. And after maybe 2 rounds of conversation, maybe 3 rounds of conversation with Una, one of the first kind of pieces of political education that she gifted us was she sat us down to watch Pa'lante Siempre Pa'lante on cassette tape. And it was the story of the Young Lords in Chicago. And most of us in the room, there was maybe 6 or 7 of us, almost all of us in that room, except for David Ford, were young Puerto Rican men and women. And David Ford lived on Grove Street and was Black. This was all Black and Puerto Rican young people. And I remember her asking us, like, what is the difference at the end of the documentary? Like, what's the difference between those young people in Chicago and all of you in this room? And, it's like, it felt like a quiz in high school. Like, man, we got to get this right. What is the difference? She was like, nah, this is like a trick question. There's no difference, right? Like, this is about understanding issues that impact young people and having the desire to tackle those issues. And the first step is to bring more young people to the table. And so her offering to us after that film was a youth stipend, a $50 a week youth stipend with access to the community space whenever we wanted it, between the hours of after school and 6 p.m. And she gave us a youth stipend for 10 hours a week. And it started off with like a $50 a week stipend, and then eventually turned into an actual part-time job. But that was my introduction to the organization. It was like a little bit of like happenstance. Who knows? Like maybe Julie and Jesus, because they would have received the same challenge from Una, maybe they would have pulled me in anyway. Maybe not. But yeah, I made that left turn and like discovered this like woman who like really challenged us as young people and invited us back over and over again. And then paid us to be youth organizers, and taught us the ropes. And then I met Andrew Friedman and all the other folks, many of whom are still at the shop today, the Nieves, the Llorelis, the Placida, like folks who've known me and who still work for us since I was 13 years old. So it's a cool story. It's like and you know, over the last 22 years, I've worn many hats here. Like I've learned I'm still learning every single day, even in my current role as co-executive director. But I don't think there's been a job in the like organizing, youth organizing or policy department that I haven't held over the last 22 years. And it's been a ride. It's been cool. It's been a journey. I think really also just like shaped my life in so many ways, right? Like not just having access to like space, like youth space to keep me off the streets as a teenager. Because, you know, me and Jesus, we were like doing the thing, but we were also kind of knuckleheads when we were young. And a lot of our circle, like a lot of the young people we grew up with, like, you know, one reason or another, you know, some of them lost their way. And so there was that, like, there was an opportunity, you know, at 13 years old, like, I know today $50 a week sounds like nothing, but at 13, back in 1999, I was like, man, I'm good. But also like, you know, like we got introduced to Sean Gillette, who's a filmmaker living out in Morocco right now, still a mentor. He was our tutor, like to make sure we actually made it through school. We got introduced to Robin Friedman, who's Andrew Friedman's sister. She was our writing coach because we had no idea how to write as 13-year-olds. Like that was the impact of a poor public education system. And Robin taught us how to structure sentences and how to read beyond grade level. And so beyond just the like organizing and creating space for young people, we were also just surrounded by people who were deeply invested in our growth. And people who like genuinely loved us as youth. And we talk to those people till this day, probably monthly. Like we're still talking to Sean, we're still talking to Robin, you know, Una's family, right? Andrew's family. And so whatever, y'all can stop me anytime.
It's incredible. No, it's an incredible story. It's gonna find its way in this book. It's such a beautiful story. So it makes me want to go a little off script and just ask you to talk about the youth part of Make the Road and kind of what that's about, what your own experience in the youth organizing as a leader, a member leader, and then as a you know organizer was, why it's part of the DNA of the organization.
Yeah, so I'll start with like the early days, and then I'll move and fast forward to like what we're doing now. The first youth organizing campaign connected to my entry point at Make the Road was called Wise Up, and it was challenging the lack of youth services and youth job opportunities that existed in Bushwick, because that was the thing that brought us in the door. So that was naturally the first campaign. Like, how do we get investment from the council and the mayor? How do we get some deep investments in our community district to impact the lives of young people? And a year, you know, it was a year's worth of like listening to elected officials in districts say like, the money's not there, the money's not there. Like, it just felt whack, right? Like as like teenagers bringing our issues to like grown folk, to adults who we knew had some like leverage and some power in the way in which we spend city dollars, and have those very same people that were supposed to be elected to represent us not tell us like, let's see what we can do, but right off the bat, just say like, can't be done. There's no money. There's no money. And what we realized the year after we launched that campaign was that very next year, it was 2000, 2001, as we're still trying to fight for youth service dollars, the city had a $64.6 million capital pot dedicated to the expansion of Crossroads and Horizons youth detention centers. And what we learned in that work through the No More Youth Jails Coalition, young people across the city, was that both detention centers weren't even at 70% capacity at the moment at which the council had decided and the mayor had decided that they were going to expand those youth jails by a couple hundred beds to the tune of $65 million. And so that became the fight for us. Like as young people, we understood like, yeah, this is bullshit. You're telling us there's no money for youth opportunities, youth programs, and youth jobs, but somehow $65 million falls out of the sky to build more youth beds in jail. Like that's our future. And so Wise Up turned into us joining this citywide No More Youth Jails campaign. A lot of those people that we're still like deeply connected to. And we won. Like after a year-long fight, of that $64.6 million, about 53 million was divested from the expansion of those two youth jails and reinvested in the Department of Youth Services. It was a citywide investment, and so it wasn't like specific to our district, but it was a win. It was a win for young people across the city. And that was the first time we organized and we won. And I tell that story for me personally, because I think that's what connected me and like kept me going in this work, right? Like having space to grow and be developed is awesome, but also understanding your power and seeing that even as a teenager, we have the power to organize and win. In the first 2 years of this work, like it just felt like anything was possible. And so I think for many of us, like that original crew of 6 to 7 young people, the person who stuck around for the least amount of time was maybe like Macho or David Ford, and they still were at it 5 to 6 years in from the day that we started. And so, you know, we're talking about like giving up our youth to do this work, not giving it up. We were still young, right? But we really invested in the work because we believed in our power given that first victory. And so the Youth Power Project continued from that campaign. And what we decided was a couple things. One is that, which I think a lot of organizers talk about, like the people closest to the problem are those also closest to the solutions. And are the folks who should lead on the work. And so if we're talking about youth investment and we're talking about campaigns that impact young people, it's cool to bring our allies and adults along, but young people need to lead that work. And so one of the things that we wanted to build out in this program is that principle, is that foundation, right? That like, we're gonna do the work until we grow and deepen the bench for the next class of young people to pick up the baton and continue to do the work. And so over the last 20 years, historically, and this is still true today, the paid youth organizers, almost all of them, are youth organizers who come from our base. They graduated from our youth leadership pipeline. We wrapped around services to make sure they were good, their families were good. If they chose to go to college, we supported them in that process. And then after that education, we asked them to come back as staff and continue to lead the work. And that's still true of our team today. The second thing is making sure that young people pick and choose the shit that they care about, right? Like, so campaigns and what we work on are chosen and identified by the impacts of what's happening around us, they're identified by young people, right? Making sure that our young people get to one, talk about like what are the issues so that we can find patterns impacting young people. Two, whether or not we can be solutions oriented, like what are the things that could tackle the problem. And then three, really think about and ask the hard questions around like what we're willing to do and whether or not we have the capacity to do it, right? Because organizers are good at making a laundry list of like the fucked upness in the world. But then you realize like, man, like we can do 10 mediocre campaigns, or we can do 2 to 3 campaigns really well and leverage victory. What kind of organization do we want to be? What kind of youth project do we want to be? And so all of that stuff we think about in our annual retreat with young people, where people decide and pick and choose like what are we about for this next year. And then the other thing is like, how do we offer the same opportunities that the Sean Gallett's and the Robin Friedmans offered me as a teenager, right? Like we want people, we want our young people to be equipped for success, whether or not their future includes organizing, right? And we talk about what are all the different elements of activism, right? Like you want to be a paid organizer, dope. We'll figure that out for you. But if you don't, and you still want to be an activist in your own right, let's talk about what interests you. And let's think about like, what are the other wraparound services? What are the other tools that we can offer young people? And how do we make sure that those young people are equipped for success? And so, we fought really hard for the community schools model. And we're currently the director of our community school at Bushwick High School campus. And one of the things that we learned about from the Philadelphia Student Union probably 15 years ago was a program called the Student Success Center. And it's a program where basically we have 4 small high schools on our high school campus. And so every year we select 2 students who are going to be the college counselors at every single high school, and 2 youth ambassadors who are going to be the folks who really like offer support to young people in dealing with conflict, but also bringing restorative justice practices into our schools so that we can help students and staff move away from discipline that actually disproportionately impact Black and brown young people and Black and brown young women more than any other population in our city. And so the program is, and the idea is, as the city continues to say, like, there's not enough money to make sure that every high school has tons of college counselors and guidance counselors, how do we create a cost-effective program? And how do we offer the same types of training to young people every summer that an adult guidance counselor or an adult college counselor would go through? How do we do that for young people over 6 weeks in the summer, and then pay them for 10, 12 hours a week to be the college counselor and the guidance counselor in their own school? And so that's the model. And we've been doing that for over a decade. And so when we talk about like, this isn't just about organizing, this is also about the make the road style of doing the work, the hybrid model of organizing and wraparound services. That's also reflected in our Youth Power Project. And so young people are helping young people understand issues that impact them and connecting them to campaigns to change those circumstances. But our young people are actually also like making appointments to get their peers screening tests so that they can get glasses if they need glasses. Our young people are teaching young people about FAFSA and how to apply for financial aid. Our young people are helping young people apply to like a pretty complicated college application process. And if they got brothers and sisters in 8th grade who need support navigating the high school application system, they're doing that too. When there are like fights or potential fights or conflict in schools, like our youth ambassadors are the restorative justice practitioners diffusing conflict in schools and helping young people understand that like there's a different way to deal with the conflict that has arisen. And so that's the potential that like that's there, right? Like I know like as adults, we're like, oh, like, you know, our parents growing up, like, you know, my mom sometimes too, like, what do you know? You're a teenager, you don't know shit, shut up. Right? And so, but like how do we flip the table and like make sure that that young people feel heard, but also that we're giving them the tools to invest in one another. And then take a back seat, let it like watch it happen in practice. And so another long-winded answer, but I hope that gets to like the our model, what we believe in and how we're doing it.
I'm really glad we did that. It really gave me a window into what this looks like. So stepping back and looking at your 20 plus years in the organization, if you were to identify a couple of stories, big moments in the life of the organization, it could be internal stuff, it could be signature campaigns where you feel like they were definitional, like they really spoke to Make the Road, or they helped define Make the Road, even for members or to external stakeholders, what would they be?
Oh man, so
I know
many.
it's a hard one. I know you got a lot of stuff to sift through.
You know, a lot of the stuff we've been talking about more recently as a result of this pandemic is like how to, in the absence of a federal government that actually responds to the real needs of everyday people, how do we build state-based power? How do we, especially now that we're not just talking about Make the Road New York anymore, right? We're talking about the Make the Road family, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Nevada. How do we build state-based power for both adults and young people? And how do we think about campaigns the way in which we thought about the Fund Excluded Workers campaign, where when we're talking about like changing public policy, we're talking about changing public policy in a way that impacts everyone in our community. And historically, Make the Road has been a shop that has primarily served first and second generation immigrant families. And so how do we make sure that anything that we touch benefits all New Yorkers? And so, you know, the Fund Excluded Workers campaign was an example of a massive $1 billion victory, like $2.3 billion or 2.1, over $2 billion. And it was in response to this global pandemic at a period in which Washington wouldn't act. And the result of inaction was that many of our folks had gone, by the point that we had won, had gone 16 months by that point without any penny coming into that household because they had lost their job, because they had lost wages, maybe their hours were cut. And every time our federal government, our state, our city were putting together packages to send checks, to send money to households, immigrants were always excluded from those packages. And so, you know, meanwhile, right, like, meanwhile, some of us who maybe didn't need that check, I didn't need that check, I was still working, right? We're getting access simply because we had a social security number and we were a citizen. And so this pandemic really made us think about, like, how do we make sure that, like, we stop touching campaigns if the result of that public policy victory isn't actually a victory that serves all people, regardless of a number of factors, including immigration status. And so we won few. And then this last year, we were thinking about, cool, how does this translate in housing? And so as a member of the Housing Justice for All Coalition, folks were talking about the need for a statewide housing access voucher program. And what we said was like, yo, we're in if we build into the language that every New Yorker, regardless of immigration status, who meets all of the other eligibility thresholds, also has access to that housing access voucher program. And we didn't win that this year, but we came close. And there is a bill introduced that specifically says this is for all households. We're covering everybody regardless of status. When we had our universal childcare fight, which is a huge issue for our moms and dads, but like our parents committee is filled with mothers. You know, the issues like childcare is one, inaccessible in so many parts of our state. Childcare deserts or the lines for access are so long that you might be waiting a full year before you can enroll your kid into a program, or they're just fucking expensive, right? Like I'm dealing with it now, right? Like, you know, like I got 2 kids and one kid is nearly $2,000 a month for childcare. And so imagine the family who might have a 1-income household that has an earner or that's like making a minimum wage, right? And so in that universal childcare fight, the framework was, how do we get to a place where we achieve universal childcare in 5 years in New York State? But also, how do we make sure that in that framework, universal means universal, like it means every New Yorker, regardless of immigration status. And that was also included in 2 different bills that were trying to achieve universal access for our families across New York State. There was a deep investment in childcare this year at the state level. We don't yet have a universal framework, and that will continue to be the fight going into next year. But the one thing that we learned this year is that the governor was explicit in saying, we're not going to let immigrant kids have access to the benefit and the subsidy. And so that's a fight that continues. In fact, we have a busload of moms in Albany today pushing the legislator to adjust the language before the end of session so that we don't limit kids whom are undocumented. But a lot of the work that we're doing is to understand that, like, how do we understand tons of different concepts, right? How do we understand racial capitalism and the role of money in politics? But also, how do we understand that we need to create some kind of test internally to make sure that we're not unintentionally leaving communities behind when we launch these big statewide public policy fights. And we're trying to do a better job at that, right? One is because we want to be inclusive of everybody. And 2 is because those are going to be bigger fights. And if we're going to be launching bigger fights, we also have to launch less fights, right? Like that's just been an issue for us historically. Like we're one of those organizations that we're involved in everything, which is great until you realize that, like, man, like bandwidth is hard. Like people feel really tired, or we're not doing as much as we can to move the needle on individual campaigns. And maybe the best thing to do is really assess whether or not we need to have 10 different fights at the same time. So those are some examples, but the few fight was massive for our young people. Like my personal one was that, like, divesting from youth jails, because I was 14 at that point, and that's what like made me believe that there was a space for young people in this work. But one that we worked on for nearly a decade, my colleague Natalia, a lot of our young people, Yaritza, who are now on staff directing our department, when they were in high school, they led the fight to pass the DREAM Act at New York State. And that was a 10-year fight, right? To make sure that that there was aid for young people to be able to access college, to be able to access and pay for college. And so the DREAM Act was a massive win for the Youth Power Project. And, you know, a couple years ago, we won driver's licenses in New York State. There's a long story there about winning it, having it taken away, and then having to win it again. You know, Deepak, you were involved, you know the backstory, but so many big wins. Deb helped author the like Wage Theft Prevention Act, one of the strongest like wage theft prevention laws in the entire country. Like that was Deb and Liz Wagner and Amy Carroll. Like our lawyers wrote that bill, right? And so, and then our members like did the organizing to win it. And so there's just like, there's so many. I'll get in trouble if like I don't name all of them, because then the organizers will be like, how come only that victory made it into the book?
Totally. I hear you. Well, I mean, honestly, part of what I'm after in this, in writing this, is to understand the secret sauce for this success, because I do think of the organization as truly exceptional. I mean, there are a lot of great organizations, but I think it was exceptional. So can we dig in a little bit on the organizing model itself? You've already talked about it some.
Yeah.
Like, what is the special sauce of the organizing model for Make the Road? What makes it distinct in your mind as you've looked at other groups, et cetera? You know, what's the heart of it to you?
Yeah, I guess I'll explain it in phases just to give you like the lifeline of a member who walks into our door. And so a member walks into our door, and the first person they're going to talk to is our receptionist. And they'll come in for whatever issue. They may come in because their wages were stolen. They may come in because they're trying to like figure out the college application process with their kid. They may come in because they found out that like we offer tenant protection services because their landlord is trying to illegally evict them. So they come in, they talk to the receptionist. And they say, hey, like I heard, or I read, or I looked up on your website that like you help individuals with these kinds of issues. We'll have wraparound services. We'll have an attorney or a health navigator or a college advocate accessible to that family. But that's not going to be the first person that they talk to. From the receptionist, the first person that they talk to is an organizer who may be organizing and has some expertise around the thing that they walked into the door seeking. So in the case of housing, and if they walked into Brooklyn, the person they're going to talk to first is Angel Vera, who's our housing organizer. And Angel has been trained, and he's been with us for a long time. So oftentimes he's the trainer. But Angel knows that he's going to get 20 to 25 minutes to sit down with this individual who's seeking some level of support and to do that agitational intake. There are some questions he needs to ask to make sure that when he makes the referral to the housing attorney or to the paralegal, that there's enough information there to start that process. But he also needs to spend a chunk of that time convincing that individual that while we can offer you that service, and we will, the reality is that you're not the first person who walked into our door today seeking that same service. And then it's his job to talk a little bit about the history of our work and what we realize happening in our community districts and in our city in relationship to evictions and the housing crisis. And it's his job in that agitational intake to convince that person to at least come and check out the housing committee. No commitment, but at least come and check out our space, which is a space filled with people just like you, who have their own cases, who understand that we have a housing crisis, and who have said, man, once a week you have this meeting, I'm down for that, because I know that unless I'm a part of the organizing efforts, I might win this case in the next month or two, but I'll be back in 2 to 3 years requesting the same housing attorney because I'll be dealing with that same issue again. Right. And so what's the underlying issue, and how do we make sure that if we're helping you, you do something not to help us, but to help your community, to help your neighbor, to help your family from having to deal with the same shit that you're going through at this moment. And so that's phase one, right? Like, how do we make sure that when people are seeking service, we offer them that, but at the same time, we give them an on-ramp to our organizing efforts. And not everybody gets on the on-ramp, but a lot of people do. We have 25,000 members in New York State. So that turns into the like, cool, like, I want to check out what this organizing stuff is about. And folks get connected to the work in that way. They join our organizing committees. And those are spaces where we're talking about issues, but those are spaces also where like, we're just building community, right? Like if you interview some of our members, there will be members who are fucking dedicated to organizing. Like they live and they breathe this shit. They've been organizing since they were teenagers back in their home country. And there are some who are committed to the work, but honestly, because they're a first and second generation immigrant, and maybe they migrated here without their families, they're just searching for community, right? Like our space is their living room. Our space is the place where they make friends, where they learn, where they get access to services. Our space is also the space where they get cooked meals. Every single committee meeting, we break bread together. We meet for an hour 15, and we spend the last 30 minutes just eating. Like our members sign up to cook for other members. You'll see before a committee meeting, 3 or 4 of them all cooking in the kitchen. You'll see after the meeting, 3 or 4 of them who have signed up to help you clean up and load the dishwasher and do all that. But like our folks genuinely take care of each other, not just in the organizing effort, but making sure that that folks feel a sense of community, understanding where we all come from. Like so many of our folks, their kids are back home, or their parents are back home, or their families are back home. Like they may be here on their own. And so that's one other element, right? Like a lot of folks, and we hope every single one of them are in it for the organizing effort, but a lot of them are in it just searching for a community. And that's a beautiful thing. And we want to be able to offer that space. And then there's the role of staff, right? And so those committee spaces are where people talk about not just campaigns we're working on, but also where we fish for what are the things happening in Bushwick? What are the things happening in Jackson Heights? What are you hearing from your neighbors and your circles? And those are spaces also dedicated to trying to understand what are the most pressing things that we need to actually discuss and design a plan around. And so when we talked earlier about members identifying the campaigns that they want to work on, every single campaign came from one of our committee meetings. It came from individuals who are members saying, yo, like this thing keeps happening and we don't quite understand why, but we should look into it. And it's at that point where that organizer, we have a monthly policy meeting, and the policy meeting is the organizers, the service, the wraparound service advocates from different departments, and the attorneys, right? So they all get together once a month for 2 hours. And what they're doing in that meeting is they're again talking about the campaigns, like what are the things each of us can and should be doing to advance the work that we have. But every meeting is also dedicated to talking about what are the patterns that we're understanding in our committee meetings or in those individual conversations that the lawyers or any of our other service providers are having with our members. What are the things that keep coming up? And if we realize 2 months, 3 months, man, this same shit is happening and the issue has been exacerbated, it's getting worse, then we understand that like something needs to be done. And oftentimes that's what leads to the kind of formation of an organizing campaign. And the cool thing is that like, and this is why like attorneys stick around and work for us, because the reality is our lawyers, they're so fucking talented. They can leave us and they can go make more money somewhere else. They just, every single one of them, they just can't, right? The reason they're with us is because they have a keen interest in not just being the advocate in the courtroom, representing a client as an attorney, but they're deeply invested in trying to cure the social issues that we see coming up in our communities. And so it's not just about being a lawyer for them, it's also about being the advocate and helping to shape public policy when I talked about writing the Wage Theft Prevention Act, our lawyers wrote that, right? So it's about, cool, there's this issue. We keep their jobs flexible enough where they can be the team of people helping our organizers think about the organizing campaign and how we craft the solution in the form of law, in the form of policy. So then we can go to electeds together, members, organizers, lawyers, and say, this is what we're understanding, and we want you to be the lead sponsor and carry our bill. And so all of that together is the secret sauce, right? It's like, how do we build community? But also, how do we have this hybrid model where we're doing the organizing, but also offering the social services, the wraparound services that our communities need right now? We want to deal with your case right now while we're organizing to pass good cause eviction. But also, like, there's so many different players and there's so much expertise, right? Like, our healthcare navigators and the people who went to school to study like healthcare policy, they're at the table with our members and our organizers, and our lawyers who understand the law are also at the table. And all of them with our members, all of them are thought partners in trying to form whatever we think the solution needs to be. And so that's really the secret sauce, right? Is bringing everybody along for the ride, from the point of walking in our door to the point of passing public policy, and then all going to that party to dance and eat and celebrate what we just accomplished. And so I don't know if you have questions about like anything in between.
I want to dig in on a couple pieces of it. Yeah. So one thing that's come across and what I've seen and then what I've heard is people talk a lot about culture. They talk about community, they talk about love, and that's pretty different than what we think of as classical organizing, power, demands, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously I know that's part of culture too, but I just want to like get you to elaborate a little more about, is that right? Is that part of the special sauce? Is that part of what's distinctive? Is the emphasis on culture, community, care, love, alongside, the focus on power and demands?
Absolutely. And it has to be, right? Like there's the building community, there's the like things that are small that sometimes you might take for granted, but it really matters. Like cooking meals together. Like it's like when you have family over, for some reason, everybody always congregates in the kitchen.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what breaking bread does for families and for communities, right? It brings us together in a deep way. And it demonstrates care, right? Because I'm making something to care and nurture for everybody else, the 50 other members that are sitting in that room, so that we can eat together. That's just one example. But also, just because like there's a lot of like work that needs to go into changing individual behaviors and individual thought processes, right? Like there are lots of people who walk in our door that are like, I'm about it. Like, I'm going to organize, I'm going to launch this campaign. We're going to be a part of it. We're going to do this thing. But they're still like, they still behave individually. They still behave rather differently, right? So they have expressed principles and interests, but because of our cultures, because of our backgrounds, because of the way we grew up, there are things that we just need to like check in one another, right? Like when we talk about cooking or cleanup, just as one example, it's always the moms in the room who raise their hand first to say, I'm down to cook for next week. And our organizers and the leadership teams have been trained to step in at that moment to be like, yo, what's up with the men in this room? Like, this ain't the way we operate. Like, we can cook too. We can clean too. Even those like little things, right? Yeah. The things that we pay attention to. And and that we strive to change in our own individual behaviors, right? To make sure that like, if we're talking about a revolution of love, and if we're talking about building community, we have to behave in that way also. You know, as we think about like organizing trans Latina women in Jackson Heights and Corona and Elmhurst, right? It took a lot of fucking work in the early days of Make the Road by Walking and Make the Road New York to get our members to understand that like the issues that impact us are the very same issues that impact our trans brothers and sisters, right? And despite the fact that we may have learned differently as young people in our home countries, or like maybe sometimes it was left unsaid, like, oh, like, you know, I don't know, like we have to check the transphobia and the homophobia in spaces, even at Make the Road, to have people understand that like, when we talk about policies being universal and all inclusive, the way in which we behave in our space needs to be universal and all inclusive. It has to work both ways. And that's true for young people, right? Like, how do we make sure, like when I shared the story of my mom being like, you know, shut up, what do you know? You're a kid. How do we make sure that adults in our spaces also understand that like, yo, when a 15-year-old comes to your committee to run a workshop, you don't get to interrupt or disrespect. You don't get to say, what do you know? You're 15, right? You get to participate, you get to listen, but you still need to treat that young person with the same amount of dignity and respect that you would treat any adult in that space. So how do we create that culture where we're building the kind of world that we want to see outside? How do we understand that we also need to build that within the four walls of our offices? If we're ever going to get to a place where building it in the outside world is even possible. And so all of that stuff is really, really important. And we spend a lot of time thinking about it. And that's also true in the product, right? When you think about the Few campaign, last year, you know, Easter just passed. And we have a lot of folks in our membership who are connected to religion, right? Many of them are practicing Christians and Catholics, and many of them celebrate Easter, for example, and Holy Week. And so one of the things that our members decided to do with our organizers was, while we were on hunger strike to win the Fund Excluded Workers campaign, they decided to invite elected officials in front of the office of Governor Hochul to wash the feet of the 13, 14 members who were fasting and who were on hunger strike to win the Fund Excluded Workers campaign, right? And that was a powerful experience. That was bridging the gap between our culture and our organizing, but also having an opportunity to shift the way in which we understand power. Usually we're asking elected officials, right, who we see as holders of power to deliver for us. And in that moment, elected officials were on their hands and knees washing the feet of first-generation immigrants who had gone 16 months without a fucking dime to their name. And that was one of the most powerful actions I've ever been a part of. And I'm not really religious in any way, right? But the demonstration of how do we think about each of the cultural elements and how do we make sure that we can demonstrate to communities that like power shifts, right? Like, and that was an example of that. It was incredible to see and be a part of. But all of that stuff, Deepak and Olivia, all of that stuff is stuff we pay attention to, and it's so necessary. Like we don't want to just measure success by talking to you all about how many campaigns we won. We also, I think a bigger indicator of our success is whether or not the person who walked into our door is leaving our organization just a better person. And if we can tell those stories about how people grow, that's powerful enough to me, right? Of course, we want to win campaigns. We have to, like, we need to shape the kind of world we want to see, but also, like, we need to invest in people, and investing in people means allowing them to bring all of the baggage that each of us hold to the table so that all of us can unpack that shit together. Sometimes those are hard conversations. But as long as we are committed to having those conversations, then we can work all that stuff out, right? So yeah, I don't know if there's more there, but that's
I find that incredibly powerful, and I don't think it's very explicitly talked about in a lot of organizing work, even though it's so fundamental to when it works, is the inner and the outer, but they've got to be joined together, and that you have a real theory and practice to do it, not just kind of intuiting it, but there's actually like a set of practices. I think it's incredible. I want to pick up on one other thing you said about the model, which is about where strategy gets made in the organization. So it sounds like the way you described it, there's strategy that gets made in the committees. There's strategy that gets made when staff who are listening from a whole variety of standpoints kind of try to put the pieces together to say, well, what do we see that's happening? How would you describe how strategy gets made?
There are two member committees for each issue area that we work on. So there's the general committee, which is meeting every week, probably 50 people in each borough office. And then each committee selects a leadership team. And that is a team of 8 to 12 member leaders whom are going to serve on the leadership team. And that team meets outside of the general member meetings, meets an additional one time per month, right? To evaluate the member meetings, to talk about, like, again, patterns, practices, what we're hearing, and to also design work plans for the next 30 days, right? Like, what are the things we need the members to engage in and do if we're going to move the needle on some of the stuff that we care about? So that's one space. But the general member meeting is really where we're trying to unpack what are the things that we're dealing with, right? That's where we're trying to understand all the issues. And then as we hear some of those things repeated month after month, the organizer starts to talk to the lead organizer about, like, this is the stuff that keeps coming up. And then they'll add that to the policy meeting, which is once a month. And that's the organizing team, the services team, and the legal team. So all the departments coming together. And the organizers will say, like, yo, like, are you guys also hearing this when you're, because, a lot of the members, they're like a part of the organizing, but they're also getting services in some form or fashion. So, like, when you're, like, building with our folks, like, are you hearing this? Are you seeing this? Is this also a pattern that you've picked up on? And that's where they workshop those things that come out of the general member meetings, right? Like, like evictions are crazy, right? Like in Bushwick, like, we've seen 40 different cases in this last month. And then the organizer will say, oh, that's wild that the legal team is seeing so many more cases, because it's the top thing that keeps coming up in the member committee. And it's at that space where people start to brainstorm. One, do we have the capacity to actually do something about this? And if the answer is yes, then how do we create space where the organizer, the leadership team of the committee, the services team, and the legal team, some formation of all of those, come together to actually brainstorm the public policy solution? And once they have generated options, like, what are some of the different paths that we can take here, the organizer and the leadership team, those 8 to 12 leaders who kind of dig in more, they bring that back to the general member meeting and they say, you know, we've noticed this pattern. We've heard you guys say this thing. We went back to the policy team. We like started to brainstorm, what are the possible avenues here? Here they are. Help us think about which avenue you think we need to take. And then it's at that point in which the members help to select the road that we take towards the solution. But not every single member is a part of the crafting of, right? So they name the problem and then they have a role once there are avenues, right? They name like which vehicle we're going to take to get to the solution. Not every single member all the time is a part of the brainstorming of what's the way to deal with it, right? But they will have a say once we have options and which option we take. But that's why we have the leadership teams, because we want members to be involved in every aspect, but it's hard to have that kind of process with 60 people in a room. And so we limit it to 8 to 12 members. I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah. I love that process and the loop that you described of how the information goes back and forth and options are framed. So can you talk about like a big, maybe like organizational wide strategic debate in the organization and how it played out? So beyond kind of individual issues, but when something rises to the, like, we're going to go all in on X, and how do those debates unfold? Like, I don't know if there was one about we're going to go all in on the fund excluded workers or something else that you remember. And it doesn't even have to be about an issue, but it could be like, we're going to go organize in, you know, I don't know, Long Island. We're going to do something differently in our model, but some debate that really kind of got people, you know, into it with each other. What's an example of that?
I mean, the biggest challenge we had was COVID. And so every year, as we think about our city level platform or our state level platform, every year, I don't know, maybe it's because of that like cassette tape that Una played for us. We're always coming out with like some version of our 10-point platform,
Yeah.
right? And that's been the thing. And it's always like our respect and dignity platform, which is a long list of items, both budget items, but also legislative items that the state legislature and the governor can deal with. And oftentimes what happens is like each committee, each issue bucket, worker justice, housing justice, environmental justice, our education justice, our Trans Latina committee in Queens, criminal justice and police reform. We work on so many different issues. Oftentimes the way in which we generate that platform is we just task each committee and organizer and team with having their like mid-year and end of the year retreats with the members and with key staff, and coming back after those retreats to say, of all the things we can possibly work on this upcoming year, these are the two things, these are the one or two things that surface to the top. And so all those things combined usually add up to a 10-point platform, sometimes more. And that becomes the thing that we shop around Albany and say, if there's one thing on education, one thing on housing, one thing on environmental justice, this should be your guide. This is the platform and the blueprint that you should follow. Every year, some of those things move, maybe two of those things move, and everything else gets parked. And then we need to continue to fight for those things the following year. And that's just baseball, right? That's just like, if we can bat 300 on our platform, we're doing well. 3 victories, big victories, cool. You know, we're going to have a big platform and we're going to do as much work as we can. We've never had a year where we checked all the boxes on the entire platform, right? But COVID forced us to think about, like, should the way we approach this legislative session be the way in which we understand baseball? Like, is it good enough to bat 300, give legislators a list of 10, and have them basically identify which 3 they'll give us this year. Or
Mhm.
have conditions been so exacerbated because of this pandemic that we actually need to be much more strategic and much more limited in what we put before legislators, to not give them that selection, to not give them that option, to say this year we're giving you 3 items because the mandate of our membership is we need all 3 items to actually move. And that was hard, because that year, what we did, when the practice was every committee gets an issue, you just tell us what is the top one, is we told members every committee doesn't get an issue this year. You all need together to think about, because of this pandemic, if there are 2 to 3 victories that we can land, those are the only 2 and 3 fights that we're going to have this session. And so some of the shit you care about may naturally be left out, but there needs to be a process by which you feel like at least you were heard and there was some democratic process to identify what surfaces to top 2 and 3. And so we partnered with Hester Street. We did the kind of, what are all the different issues? Organizers got the opportunity to visit different committees, to talk to members from cross committees about what's their issue and why they think their issue is the thing that we should be fighting for during COVID. Some of them naturally said like, yo, we know what other committees are pushing and actually we're going to sit this out. Like, we get it. And the reality is, even in our own committee, we don't think our issue should be top 2, right? It's the issue we do the most work on, but we don't think our issue should be top 2. And so after we did the education, everybody talked to each other and educate every committee about all the issues. We also did a series of virtual town halls to bring like hundreds of member leaders together. We did a series of those to talk to people about what are all the things that are possible and what should surface to the top 2 or 3. And then we commissioned a survey of over 1,000 members that make the road that we partnered with Hester Street to do. And we did a round of surveys. I think over 1,400 members were surveyed. And then we released a report, first to our membership and then to the public, where Hester Street allowed us and worked with us to really dig in on the interviews and the surveys that they were having with members, to understand of all the things happening currently in the context of COVID, what are those things that worry you the most? And 2 things came up. One was, I don't know how I'm going to put food on the table because I lost my job, I lost wages, I'm undocumented, and none of the federal relief is coming my way. And that launched the Fund for Excluded Workers fight. And then the other thing that came up was, as a result of not getting any income, I have no fucking idea how I'm going to pay my rent. And I don't know what I can do to prevent the eviction of me and my kids and put us in a situation during a global health crisis where we're going to end up in a congregated and overburdened shelter system where not only are we homeless, but also we are exposed to the threat of COVID. The third thing that came up was in relationship to jails, prisons, and immigration detention center. And so because it ranked number 3, we also did some work there. And that was our members, because of their immigration status, feeling like, holy fuck, what's going to happen to my husband? What's going to happen to my loved one who's now being held in an immigration detention center where we haven't heard any plans for dealing with the spread of COVID inside of holding facilities? And so those were the 3 issues. And so at the state level, we knew that the state legislature had real power in making decisions around the Fund for Excluded Workers and creating, one, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which we won to pay back rent accumulated during COVID. But also we won the eviction moratorium, a statewide eviction moratorium to guarantee that people could not be evicted. And so the issues that we decided, every committee drop what you're doing and work on few and work on housing. When we did that, the lesson was that we won everything. Everything we said we were set out to win during COVID, we actually won. And so right now, the lesson in that is a conversation we're taking into this year's retreat. Do we go back to the old way of doing where every single committee is issue focused and you identify your one thing for our platform? Or is there a reason for us to understand and discuss with our membership whether or not every year we should have that same process, even post-COVID, and just choose the 3 top issues that surface across the board and have everybody work on those 3 top issues? Because what we learned was when every committee worked on the same thing, we won all those things because we increased our capacity, right? We had 13 organizers instead of working on 13 issues. We had now 13 organizers working on 3 issues. And so that's going to be something we discuss this year, right? Like, what was the lesson in that? And is that something we should explore moving forward or not? Or maybe if people feel like, yeah, it's like, kind of feels like, maybe it kind of feels whack to, like, if my thing doesn't surface to the top, right? Like, and that came up for some of our members in relationship to environmental justice, right? Because there's a fucking threat right now, but so many people are like, oh, like, if the threat isn't like gonna impact me in my lifetime, right? Like, then we have to deal with the immediate, the right now. And we're still doing a lot of education around environmental justice, but we got a ways to go, right? Like, there's still lots of community members who understand the threat, but who don't understand the threat as the threat of now. And so even for those organizers and members, they're like, man, like, until we do that education more deeply, environmental justice work will never raise at this organization to top 3. And so there might be some level of discomfort with that approach because they feel like we have to address the climate crisis, but it might not be top 3 when you consider the fact that, like, people don't have apartments or wages today. And that's the thing that's top of mind.
I was going to ask about that, about the criteria for the issue. It seems like the main thing that you were using there were, what is the most deeply felt, urgent thing that people are really willing to go to bat for and fight for?
Yeah, give me 1 second. I'm going to move inside because my battery's dying. And
yeah, go for it.
So give me 1 second.
Yeah.
And then I have criteria I can send you all.
Oh, okay, great.
We have criteria. Like, we have like a measuring stick of like 8 to 10 things that committees have to grapple with in order to decide.
Oh, fantastic.
Surfaces to the top.
That's fantastic. So I want to cover a couple of things before we close.
Give me 1 second. Let me.
Oh, yeah.
The chart. So just on criteria, and I'll send this over to you.
Yeah.
But these are some samples of like guiding questions that we ask at our organizing retreats, right? So there's the basic stuff. There's like, is this campaign going to move large groups of everyday people to join, right? Like,
yep.
Like we want to work on shit that will build people power. Is this that thing? Like, you got to be sexy enough. Otherwise, like, if we can't build our base, we're not going to win. There's also, like, when we talked about like internalized oppression and interpersonal oppression, the way in which people behave and interact with other people, but also the way in which people think about issues. That's another metric. Like, will this campaign transform the way our communities think about this issue, right? Right now, public safety is that issue at the city level under this mayor. Like, all of the canvases we're talking about doing in districts is to really transform the way that people think about public safety. Because like investment in cops, subway sweeps of homeless people, like that's not the kind of shit that's going to address the issues that we want to see addressed in our city, right? Like sweeping homeless people off the subways doesn't address gun violence, right? So let's talk about the things that will and the things that our communities need. And that's an issue where we need to do a lot more meeting people where they are, right? There's the defund work, and then there's the like Blue Lives Matter work. Most people sit in the middle, right? And so how do we talk to those people in the middle about the fact that when the mayor says you're either with police or not, right? That's a false dichotomy. That's a false choice. Like you can think about solutions to public safety without thinking about more investments in policing. There's also like, the metric of like, do we have the tools we need right now to challenge the power brokers and win, right? Like what's our analysis? Can we do this in 2-3 years? Or is this like a North Star 10-year fight? And we want to understand that so that we understand how much resource and also whether or not we're ready to take that on if we don't think that we have the tools in this moment to actually win this in the next 2 to 3 years. There's questions about like staff capacity. There's questions about member capacity. There's questions about funding, right? Like, how is philanthropy going to relate to this issue? That is the thing that will score the lowest. We never want to be driven by that, but we want to ask that question because we need to know whether or not there's going to be resource for the work, right? And then there's other stuff, and there's stuff. One important question as we think about like, man, are we going to keep working on 20 campaigns, or can we like really dig in on like a smaller number? One of the important questions is there a path to move this campaign without Make the Road being at the table? Like if we have enough allies working on it and we feel like they can win it without us, awesome. Like that should be a factor. Let's move on. Let's talk about all the other issues that we want to address. So those are some samples. I can send you the questions, but those are the things that our members are grappling with and our staff are grappling with annually to break their campaigns into 3 tiers. Tier 1 being, this is a priority campaign. We're going to spend real investment here. Tier 2 being, this is going to require some work, but it's not like our top priority. And tier 3 being, members are not going to engage in this work, but we're still going to track it. Like we want to pay attention to what's happening on this matter. And so tier 3 is like, we're going to pay attention, but we're not really in it. We're not really throwing down. And so when they grapple with the questions, then they have this chart where they identify with all these issues, what's tier 1, what's tier 2, what's tier 3.
Great. So 2 last questions for you. One, kind of back to the model, just thinking about the organizing model over time. So how has it changed? And like what, if anything, are you thinking about needing to change, develop, grow, add in the future? So kind of looking at the model over time.
So I think there's 2 things that we're doing now. I mean, there might be more than two things, but one thing is like, as we like, how do we replicate my story for more members, right? Like, how do we put members in a position where when we post for jobs, they're the person best equipped to apply for that job and gain access to that job, right? We need to bring more members into our shop, not just to be the organizers. How do we make sure that our members are equipped to be the health navigators, the receptionists, the policy strategists, the communications associate, the paralegal, right? For all these jobs, how do we make sure that we are investing in, especially our core leaders, to best position them to compete for the jobs when they open up in-house? So there are two things that we're piloting that were a part of our 5-year strategic plan. Our legal department is working out a legal pilot program where basically, and this is because of so many young people in our Youth Power Project, they're going to be creating internships and they're going to be assigning basically coaches, staff coaches, to partner and pair up with individual members who have a keen interest in possibly studying law. And so the point of that is, if there are young people or members who have that interest and are debating, like, is law the thing for me? How can law translate into being connected to organizing? They're creating an on-ramp before the point at which our communities decide to spend those big bucks at law school, right? So how do we give them access to an internship, but also access to our staff in this pipeline program to get them to really think about whether or not law is the thing for me, but also to really interpret, like, what are all the ways in which you can use those skills, right? Like, in-house, we don't want our lawyers just to be lawyers. We want our lawyers to, like, help us drive public policy, right? And so that's one thing that the legal team is putting together this year, possibly launching this summer, is how do we create an on-ramp, given that we've heard so many young people say that they have an interest in law. The second internship program is we already have Leadership School Level 1 and Leadership School Level 2. Those are 7-week intensives that Mateo runs. Mateo is our leadership development coordinator. And that is like organizing and pedagogy, right? That's just like politicizing our base, making sure our base understand the campaigns that we're working on and how those campaigns intersect. And then level 2 is like the introduction to organizing. So pedagogy, political analysis, leadership school level 1, level 2, introduction to organizing. How do we take what we've learned and what does it mean for putting together a campaign? We've always talked about level 3. This is going to be the first year that we pilot level 3. Level 3 will be accessible to members who graduated from level 1 and level 2 and who want a paid internship in organizing. And so what they would do is for 6 weeks, they would shadow, they'd be paid for 10. We're trying to finalize numbers. So we don't know if it's going to be for 6 hours a week or 10 hours a week. But basically, it is a paid internship where they're going to shadow the organizer in their committee, and they're going to partner with that organizer to develop that 6-week work plan. And they're going to do the work. They're going to get to it, and they're going to hit the ground. They're going to go canvas. They're going to do the phone banks. They're going to help design agendas for committee meetings. They're going to run committee meetings. They're going to step into the shoes of their organizer for 6 weeks, and they're going to do the work. And so that's one thing that we've always talked about. Like, like you can do, and we need to, we spend a lot of time on political analysis and talking about, organizing 101, but there's just there's some shit you just can't learn unless you're doing it in practice. And that's the thing that level 3 will be starting this year. So that's one thing. That's we got to get these pipeline programs ready, piloted, tested, and then ready to be the thing moving forward in-house at Make the Road. So there's that. There was another thing and I forgot it. So maybe
okay, come back to you.
Yeah.
So last question for you maybe is about, by the way, this was an incredible conversation. I got a huge amount out of it. So last question for you is, you kind of referred to it, Make the Road feels like it operates from an ideological framework. What is it?
I mean, for our members, it's rather simple. For our folks, our frame for anything and everything we touch is that when we talk about the world in which we're striving to build, it's one that that's really centered in respect and dignity for all people. And so all of our stuff, our scarves, our notepads, right? Everything in our branding and everything in our work is really centered around respect and dignity for all. And so that's what grounds us. That's what centers us. And of course, there are all kinds of other things that we want to process with our base to make sure that we're doing these equity tests on campaigns, for example. But it really just is about respect and dignity and treating all people with respect and dignity, so that it's not just translating into the work and into the campaign and political arena, but that it's also something that's easy to remember. And it's also something that we believe we have to operate from as individuals. If you want to be connected to this work and to this movement, the least you can do is treat your counterparts with respect and with dignity. And so when you interview our members, that's the thing that I think will come up in Spanish, respeto y dignidad. But that's the thing that I think is really the glue to all of the work.
So maybe one last question I'll sneak in, because that just made me think about it, is what's the future? What's the big dream for the organization in terms of longer term ambitions, having gotten to this incredible point? Is there some next frontier that's on your mind, on the organization's mind?
Well, we just hired Frontline Solutions. So we wrapped up our 5-year strategic plan under our predecessors, Javier and Deb. And we are starting, actually, our first retreat is tomorrow.
Gotcha.
Tomorrow is the first retreat, and we have a 9-month journey with our staff and members.
Awesome.
Answer exactly that question. What does the next 5 years hold for Make the Road? And there are some things that we know will be included, right? We have 25,000 members. We want to have more than that in 5 years, right? We understand that the power that we have is the power in numbers. And so we want to continue to build our base to grow as a force within New York State. We know that the model, right? Deep investments in organizing, but equal investments in wraparound services works. And we want to double down in those investments for our communities. We know that one of the mandates from our membership has been for Make the Road to think about as we're forcing governments to think about serving the needs of individuals at scale, of communities at scale, like the Fund for Excluded Workers, one of the mandates from our membership is to really think about, yeah, we want to do that at scale, and that's the role of government. But we also may need some like member safety pots, right? To make sure that at a moment of crisis for leaders of our organization, in that moment of crisis, there's some infrastructure, there's some pot that people may be able to tap to get to, you know, my house just went ablaze. I have absolutely nothing. I'm currently in the shelter system and I lost everything, right? And so how do we get to a place where we could meet the needs in those kinds of extreme examples, right? So that's some stuff. You know, for me, Theo and Arlenis, and we've been talking a lot about this together. The big challenge for us is how do we get New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Nevada to the scale of New York in less than 25 years? Like, it took us 25 years to build this engine.
Yeah.
We've learned a lot in those 25 years. We now have offices in 4 other states. We're now a national entity. And those offices don't have, many of them, more than 20 staffers. And they have operating budgets of maybe between 1 million and 3 or 4 million, right? And so how do we get to a place where that secret sauce that you asked about, we can spend more time partnering with our state directors, tweaking the secret sauce so that it makes sense for their state, but getting them to a place where they can achieve what we've been able to achieve in New York in the next 5 years, not in the next 25 years, right? Because now we've done it. And I've been here for 22 years. Arlenis has been here for probably 18, 19, 20 years. Theo has been here for 16 years. We've done it. We know how to do it. We've done it. And so I think that's another big challenge for us. Like, how do we give equal investment and equal time to the Make the Road family so that members in each of the other states can also see the fruits of their labor. And so, and that's, you know, that's something for each of us. I don't know, that's something we've ever had to think about before. Like, this role is forcing us to think about shit. Like, it's not just about New York. Like, we're trying to build something nationally, and we're trying to have a national impact and a national brand. And we're learning in that process, and we're doing it collaboratively with the state directors. But, like, you know, I don't know. Javier never told me that would be my job. And it is, but it's a challenge, but it's an exciting challenge, man. Right. And
it is really exciting. I can't say enough, Jose, how grateful I am. This was an incredible interview, and it's just making me reflect on how we need to do the work of the organization justice. So you have my word, we'll do our best, and we'll come back, and I'm gonna try to see another thing or two along the way too. And you and the crew will get a chance to see what we write and all that before it goes to print. But I just wanted to say gratitude for the conversation. More importantly, just gratitude for you and this organization. What a treasure.
Yeah. Appreciate that. And I know it sounds poetic, because in some ways I'm protective of the organization as well. It's not it's not always as easy as it sounds.
I do know that.
There are lots of internal fights here.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of messiness, and so, but you know, that's true for any organization. That's like setting communities up to thrive. And so we have our challenges, and I think you'll, as you continue to do these interviews with staff and members, some of that stuff will come up.
All good.
And it's important to tell that story in the book too, right? Like
It
we
is.
have lots of success, but we've also had lots of challenge.
Yeah.
Amen. Thank you, brother.
That was amazing.
Take it
My
easy.
hands
We'll
are
be back.
tired typing
We
so much.
appreciate
All right, bye.
Appreciate you
Thanks,
guys.
Jose. Yeah.